Welcome. You're listening to Words and Actions, a podcast about how language matters in business, politics, and beyond.
There is language A at one end, there's language B at the other end, and there's the interpreter as a machine in the middle. Whatever you feed at one end comes out transformed in the target language with no issues whatsoever. That is very much the perception in my experience.
The man you've just heard is Christoph Credens, a forensic linguist from Aston University. We will hear him later in the episode with some fascinating insights into legal translation. But for now, let's focus on the metaphor that he used in his criticism about how professionals, and I think many non-interpreting people, view the work of interpreters.
Yeah, he used the machine metaphor, didn't he? You know, that you can feed something in, it gets miraculously transformed in the machine and comes out at the other end.
Yes, I mean, when I heard him say this metaphor, I couldn't help but think about Aaron Stibbe's distinction between helpful metaphors and destructive metaphors, because the machine metaphor, is very much a destructive metaphor.
Yeah, and it also ties in with this larger idea, this idea from engineering about communication just being sending little packages around that get encoded and decoded. And it's a bit like the same mechanistic view of language processing, and which completely disregards the human factor in it.
Now, it is precisely these issues that we're going to be focusing on in our episode today. My name is Erika Darich. I'm calling from Groningen in the Netherlands, and my co-hosts are Veronica Culler.
Hello there, I'm calling in from the UK.
And Bernard de Klerk.
Hi, everyone. So welcome. This is the official welcome to the Words and Actions podcast. And you know that we explore the world through the language lens in business, politics, and beyond. And in this episode, we'll actually do all of that. There will be business, there will be politics, and there will be beyond as well.
Bernard, you're actually from the Department of Translation, Interpreting, and Communication. And this episode is closest to home for you, right?
Yes, absolutely. I'm not an expert in translation theory or interpreting, but I'm surrounded by colleagues who are, and it's a fascinating world. So I've taken the liberty to invite someone, an actual direct colleague of mine, and I share an office with her, Katrijn Marijns, and she does research on communicative processes in asylum-seeking procedures in institutional context. So there's a lot of issues there, of course, and there is translation and interpreting and multilingual aspects. So I think that will be an interesting talk we'll have with her.
Right, so we'll discuss translating and interpreting in legal contexts and other high-stakes interactions. But also, we won't disappoint listeners who are here for language and business. So we have a Words and Actions tradition, so where we have, in each episode, we have what we call an analysis. And this week, we enlisted the help of Victoria Niediger-Schröder from the Norwegian School of Economics. So that will be our business part later on in this episode.
And I'm really looking forward to analyzing the data she brought us. Okay, so translation and interpreting. We kind of touched on these in our last episode, didn't we? We talked about multilingualism, and we talked a lot about finding a common code when in workplaces where people from many linguistic backgrounds work together. This is often called the lingua franca, which is most often English, right?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And we also talked about accommodation. Remember where one speaker adjusts their language or their speech style or language variety to the listener for easier understanding. And, oh yeah, Erika, how's your own linguistic accommodation to Dutch going then?
Okay. Well, it's going slower than I expected. I can tell you one thing. Google Translate is my new best friend.
Here we go, automatic translation.
Yeah, but I have to also tell you, it's not a very good friend.
Oh!
I thought that I was your Dutch-speaking best friend, but anyway, doesn't matter. It's okay, Erika. Continue.
Well, you are, Bernard, and I'm actually going to ask you something to help me with. So
here comes karma.
A couple of days ago, I needed to choose official swimwear for my son's water polo competition, and the team sent me the link, and of course the website was in Dutch. So Google Translate, here I come. I put it through Google Translate, and all words translated into swimsuit. So I looked at the Dutch version. There were 2 Dutch words. So one of them is, and I urge the listeners to have mercy on me with my Dutch translation here, water polo zwembroek, and the other one was water polo badpak.
Okay. Zwembroek.
Did I say it right, Bernard?
That's fantastic. Zwembroek and badpak. Great. Yeah.
Okay, but here's the problem. Both of them were translated as swimsuit. So I stood there thinking, okay, so what do I order for my son? So Bernard, which one do I order for my son? Zwembroek or buttplug?
I think he'd be happy with the zwembroek. He wouldn't be happy with the buttplug because that's what you have for the females.
Yeah, that might actually have consequences
Yeah.
here, in terms of social sanction and what have you. So,
Yeah, blending in, credibility issues, playing water polo, perhaps. Yeah, so with the zwembroek, we're referring to speedos, basically. Yeah. Yeah, and then you have further distinctions between, the actual shorts, and then you have the tight-fitting speedos as well. So you have to make sure that he's wearing the right ones.
Yeah, but it's tricky when all the translations say swimsuit.
Yes, so that wasn't a good translation job there. Absolutely not. No. But you've actually hit on an issue there, Erica, because that is what's often described in translation studies as equivalence. And that's something we'll be talking about later. But let's start at the beginning now. Okay, so what is translation? I guess what comes to mind first is what's actually known as interlingual translation. So that's from one language to the other. But that's actually not the only type. So what else have we got?
Yes, that's true. We also have intralingual translation. So we have one in the same language, but we have varieties of the same language.
And of course, it doesn't stop at language, right?
No, we have another type of translation. It's very interesting, but also very complicated, is multimodal translation. So we have different semiotic systems there. It's not just words and language. Then we're also talking about colors and fonts and images and how these may work differently across cultures. This type of translation is often referred to as cultural adaptation or localization. So IKEA, for instance, they may depict a same-sex couple in the catalog in some countries, but not in others. And the same applies to colors. I'm sure that you're aware of the ugly green-eyed monster, a reference that we have to refer to jealousy.
Shakespeare, actually, yeah.
Yeah, that wouldn't work in Asia because you do not have that link from green to jealousy there. So they wouldn't get it.
Or red is a happy color, or white is a color of mourning.
Absolutely.
And etc. So there's a lot where you could put your foot in. And that's just color, really, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess what you mentioned earlier about that localization matters a lot. And I think this is what we're going to be hearing about in our analysis from Victoria.
Yes, she will definitely be examples.
And talking about types of translation, there is something that we call intersemiotic translation, where a communicative event in one sign system is translated into another sign system. Can we think of examples?
Subtitling. So when you hear it spoken in a film, but you see it written in another language. And also when you translate into sign language, perhaps. So what the sign language translator or interpreter hears is translated into something visual again. Is that what you're thinking of there?
Yes, great examples.
Yeah, audio description is another example. And there you translate the visual information into auditive information for the visually impaired. And that's another example.
Oh, the other way around.
Often forgotten, but quite interesting. And then our guest, Christophe, and I mentioned him earlier, he was referring to a new type of profession for interpreters, which is also based on intersemiotic translation.
Yeah, so that's something that we haven't discussed here a lot on the podcast. It's definitely the beyond. So we're here looking at intelligence gathering. We're looking at, spies, basically. So he said, Christoph, that is, said there's so much communication these days, so that is intercepted by intelligence agencies, that there's actually a new breed or a new kind of translators altogether.
So there seems to be a new profession emerging, which is wiretap interpreting. And a wiretap interpreter is someone who listens to intercepted communications in real time and then takes notes, prepares a transcript for the decision makers to then decide whether to act on a particular piece of intelligence or whether to file it.
So this is quite different from the machine metaphor that we started off with, isn't it? If you think about all the processes that are involved there, it's not a surprise that in translation theory, translators and interpreters are often referred to as decision makers themselves. There's a lot going on, and you can't just grab that with a machine metaphor.
Yeah. So the translator is decision maker, really.
We'll talk about this later when we talk about implied meaning and pragmatics, how decisions matter. And this, I really like the wiretap translator example, because this also highlights how we can categorize translation and interpreting in all sorts of different ways. So, for example, in this case, we can make distinctions based on, for example, the tools that people use, whether the translation takes place simultaneously, and the various modes involved. So translation can be consecutive, interpreting can be simultaneous. We have what we call dubbing, machine translation, of course, and things like post-editing. These all raise their own challenges.
Yeah, they do. They do. And we can't discuss them all in this episode, but, it will come up again. So these are very different in terms of specific challenges, but translation in general faces one major challenge, and that is what's often referred to as equivalence. So it's this issue of equivalence that basically prevents the job of a translator or interpreter to be like the metaphorical machine, because they have to take various decisions, and the concept of equivalent is really everywhere in translation studies and comes up at many different levels of language. So translation studies and theory is a huge subdiscipline of linguistics itself, if it is even a subdiscipline. And we really don't have enough time or, to be honest, expertise, to give a full account, but we'll put some seminal works in the blog. So, for instance, the work by Mona Baker, also the work by Werner Koller, who is No Translation, and others. And yeah, you'll find that on the blog. But to illustrate aspects of equivalence, we will use mostly Mona Baker's work here, which is called In Other Words. But of course, there are also other frameworks out there. So the first type of equivalence is lexical equivalence. Can you guys give some examples, perhaps?
Or maybe let's start with some sort of definition. So this idea of lexical equivalence is finding the right meaning or transferring the right meaning of a word or lexical item from the source language into the target language. And this seems like a simple task, doesn't it? So you have a word in English, for example, table, and then probably I should know this now in Dutch. Bernard, help me out here with...
Tafel.
Oh, Tafel, yes, of course, Tafel. And then we've got German and all the other languages. But what happens when that word has a slightly different meaning in the target language? So I'll give you an example. This is from business. So a Scandinavian vacuum manufacturer, you may know Electrolux. In English and in a campaign in America, they used the phrase, "Nothing sucks like Electrolux." Of course.
I mean, it rhymes, okay, but...
So, the referential meaning is the same, but how the effect translated from one language to the other is perhaps not the one Electrolux was after.
No, and I mean, you have these false friends, don't you? And I thought when you discussed with, table in Dutch meaning Tafel, and Tafel is actually also a German word, and you can use it for a kind of table, but it would be like a lavish banqueting table. So your kitchen table is not a Tafel, that's a Tisch. So there's really lots of nuances there.
There's another nice example from a car brand, Toyota. And here even you could see that the simple combination of a couple of letters and a number leads to problems. So they had this new model, a two-seater model, the Toyota MR2. So M for mid-engine, R for rear-wheel drive, and the 2 for a two-seater. And they used the same letter combination, number combination in France, and it raised a fair number of chuckles, because in French, that reads as merdeux, merdeux. Yeah? Voici mon Toyota MR2, and you're actually saying, look at my crappy Toyota. So they actually dropped the 2 after a while. So it just became an Toyota MR.
Yeah, we have that, but we also have where words are false friends or they sound funny or what have you. But we also have lexical gaps, right? Where one concept or word in the source language really just doesn't exist in the target language, usually due to culture. So, for instance, in Danish, you have a word that is tensmør, which literally translates as tooth butter. And it refers to the amount of butter that you put on a slice of bread, that it's so much it will leave tooth marks. Now, don't ask me why that is particularly pertinent, for Danes, but it seems to be because they have a word for it.
Yeah.
Can I just add one item on that breakfast tisch or tafel next to our tons more laden bread, a word from Dutch, which I quite like, and I know it's untranslatable, or maybe... I think it is. So it's hagelslag.
Oh, hagelslag. Oh, yeah. Well, that's chocolate sprinkles. It's normally translated at, right? But you have it actually on buttered bread.
Yes.
Yes. So, which is the way to eat it. You don't put it on a cake. You put it on buttered bread. Yeah. And it just means hailstorm, doesn't it? Hagelslag.
Yes, it does. What is interesting, Erica, in Flanders, we have a different word for it. We also have hagelslag, but we have a different word, muizenstrontjes, and that actually means mouse droppings.
it's getting better and better, really. You're eating mouse tropics in Flanders.
Yes, so don't be startled if you hear someone, or if someone asks you, do you want Meusestroontjes on your bread? It's okay, it's hagelslag.
Okay, that's worth knowing, I think. But moving on with our equivalences. So apart from lexical equivalence, we also have grammatical equivalence.
Yes, grammatical equivalence, and then we're talking about syntactic structures, and you may be thinking, what can go wrong there? But a lot can go wrong. If you think, for instance, of the use of actives and passive clauses, there's a lot you can do with passive clauses. You can hide things, right? You can hide the agent. But if you do it in a wrong setting, you turn passive into active and vice versa. Things can go wrong. And I would like to give you an example, or if anyone else has an example. My example is from politics. So we have to go back to the Cold War, to a speech given by Nikita Khrushchev, where he was actually saying that the Russians didn't want to give up. That was the basic message. And in English, it translates as, "We will live to see you buried." But that's a bit grim already, isn't it? But the translator turned that into, "We will bury you." So we actually went from a passive construction to an active construction. So in the US, that was a kind of signal, that may be leading to an actual nuclear attack. So that translation or that interpreting session, raised political tensions to an actual tipping point.
It just shows how much responsibility interpreters have in high-stakes situations.
Right, and how mistranslations can really have dire consequences, can't they? So, and not just in politics, but in a whole range of contexts. Think about legal contexts, like police interrogations. And I wonder if you remember our guest, Dr. Credence from the Institute of Forensic Linguistics at Aston University. We asked him for a story about a real case where there was a problem with translation, and this is what he had to say.
Before the police start to ask you questions related to the alleged offence, they caution you. And there's standard wording for the police caution. It essentially tells you that you can remain silent, you don't have to say anything. However, if you choose to remain silent, and then later at trial you actually start talking, the jury might draw negative inferences about why you were silent in the first place. So they will ask, why didn't you talk to the police when you had the chance? Why are you now telling us all these things when you could have told them during the police interview? And essentially what happened in this particular case was that the police provided the caution to the suspect, and the caution read that you have the right to remain silent, but if the case then goes to court, the jury might draw negative inferences for you, for your case. So there is a conditional phrase there, if the case goes to court. Okay, and the way the interpreter translated it was, you have the right to remain silent, but then the case will go to court. So if you remain silent, the case will go to court. Okay, now police interviews with suspects are fairly long normally, and that means that the caution is repeated a number of times before each portion of the interview, if you like. And this particular interpreter in this case, she got the police caution right roughly 60% of the time, and she got it wrong 40% of the time. And then the question arose, was the suspect then a fully participating actor in this particular setting? So in other words, did he know what the implications of the police caution were, or did they get the wrong idea because of the interpreter's mistake? As I said, roughly, 60% of the time, the interpreter did get it right. And I put that in my report, but as far as I know, the case proceeded and the suspect was found guilty of manslaughter. So at the end of the day, the problem was not picked up in the courtroom as a serious issue. I think it was noted. The defense lawyer certainly introduced it in court and said, Your Honor, the police interview should be thrown out because the suspect didn't understand the police caution. So that must have happened. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't have commissioned my report. But it doesn't seem to have had any consequences on the final outcome.
If you think about consequences on the final outcome, there's another type of equivalence that we need to talk about, because a lot can go wrong there. Pragmatic equivalence. The eternal tension between what is said and what is actually meant or implied. And we even have that problem within the same language.
So conversational implicature, that's a problem. How do you translate that, really?
And one aspect perhaps that is important is degrees of directness. So we can have the use of imperatives, sit down, for instance, but would you like to sit down is another realization of a directive. So telling people what to do is realized differently across languages. And in some language, yeah, maybe impolite to do so. In another language, may be perfectly fine. So in Russian and Spanish, for instance, I have the impression that there are more imperatives. What do you think?
Well, speaking neither Russian nor Spanish, I couldn't possibly comment, really, But I know that sometimes, I've lived longer outside Germany than I've ever lived in it at this point. And sometimes when I go back to Germany for the first day or two, I think, why are people ordering me around all the time?
Yeah, that was very much my experience here in the Netherlands too. I really had to get used to from the British culture or English culture of expressing every directive in the most indirect way.
Yeah, you don't say sit down unless you say it to a child. You say, would you like to sit down, or why don't you have a seat, or something like that.
Yeah, and then you get interpersonal attention, and that has to be taken care of. And the translator is always negotiating between the source language and the target and the target language, and finding the right solution for that meaning or intention.
So there's an awful lot of stake, really, and because there is, and there can be consequences and drama and what have you, there's actually quite a few films which center around translation and interpreters, etc. So Lost in Translation is one of them. And there's also, there is a film called The Interpreter. So Nicole Kidman, there is an interpreter who works for the UN in New York, and she was raised in fictional African countries, so she speaks the indigenous language there. And it represents the actual work of an interpreter, really. So who is working, in this case, for one of the most important institutions in the world, the United Nations. And it shows how accurate and precise an interpreter has to be. So here's an excerpt. Bernard, do you want to read that with me?
Sure, absolutely. You'll be Sylvia then?
I'll be Sylvia.
Okay.
I don't care for him.
Wouldn't you mind if he were dead?
I wouldn't mind if he were gone.
Same thing.
No, it isn't. If I interpreted gone as dead, I'd be out of a job. If dead and gone were the same thing, there'd be no UN at all.
That's interesting, because that's another conversational implicature where you can interpret things in two different ways. Other films that I'm thinking of, Blood Diamond, Dances with Wolves, we go way back in time now, Arrival, Windtalkers, Zero Dark 30, they all feature translation or interpreting in them.
Absolutely, and perhaps I could give a little plug here that there's actually a watch-along series called Linguists at the Movies, which find them on Twitter. They're really good. And, who have shown some of these films and will perhaps show others in the future.
Right. I like that as a little homework for our listeners to watch a film and think about these issues related to translation and how complex it can become in terms of decision making. And maybe we can use this time now to summarize some takeaway messages from our little introduction. One of those being how destructive the metaphor machine is when you think about translating, and how you really should think about translating and interpreting in terms of decision making and repurposing the text into new cultural contexts.
Yes, and also translation is not about one code being able to match with a different code 100%. It's not about translating words and sentences, etc. It's about translating meaning and finding the best code to transfer this meaning.
And someone who will be able to talk a lot more about that is our next guest, Katrijn Marijns, and she'll be talking about interpreting and translating in a high-stakes context again, that of asylum-seeking procedures. Right, I'm happy to introduce Katrijn Marijns. She's assistant professor in the Department of Translation, Interpreting and Communication, but she's also my office buddy. So we talk about lots of things and there's a lot of chit-chatting going on. But today I think it's going to be one of the most serious conversations we've had in a long time, isn't it, Katrijn?
Yes, I guess so.
So we'll talk a bit about the asylum seeking procedure. Now, in this episode, we've already referred to high stakes contexts. And this, of course, is a context that is very high stakes, right? We have people who are at important crossroads in their lives. And as you refer to their profiles, they are linguistically challenged profiles. So you have issues in terms of communication as well. What are the main problems that you encounter? So you've done a lot of research into this. What are the main problems during asylum seeking procedures when it comes to crossing language and culture boundaries?
Mm-hmm. Now, the asylum encounter in itself is a very demanding situation for applicants for international protection, but also for asylum officers, because they have to talk about complex personal experiences that are contextually very dense. And they have to do that in an institutional and a bureaucratic, very formal setting. And on top of that, they have to answer questions in ways that afterwards the answers start to lead their own life, and it can be very consequential for them, for their personal lives. This is already very complex in itself, but on top of that, indeed, we have this whole multilingual context, this dimension, which makes it even more challenging. And probably one of the biggest challenges is to address linguistic variation, something that naturally goes hand in hand with the enormous diversity of people who enter the procedure. But apparently it's very difficult for the asylum authorities to deal with that variation.
When you refer to linguistic variation, what do you mean specifically? Is it levels of proficiency or?
Languages especially. Well, I can give you a clear example. English, for example, is a global language. Many people speak the language, but they speak it in many different ways, different varieties. In such an asylum context, for example, you have an asylum officer who speaks, let's say, Flemish or Dutch English. But when the applicant comes from an African country, that English will be very, very different. In the first place, pronunciation will be different. African speakers might use different words, are usually more proficient. I mean, the English of the Flemish officers is usually really good. But of course, it's only a second or a third language. When an African speaker uses English, the vocabulary will be much more elaborate because it's a first language for many of them. And this can be problematic if they have to talk about issues that require certain detail, subtleties. And if these are not really being picked up, this can be really problematic because these details are used as a source of examining credibility. If somebody's not able to talk about something in sufficient detail, or if the detail is simply not being picked up by the interlocutors, by the asylum officer, then the information gets lost. And this is really problematic when it comes to assessing the credibility of an applicant.
So the way you describe these complexities and the really extremely high stakes here makes me so uneasy. Can you put my mind at ease about how prepared and well-trained these officers are, and what are the techniques they use, or how are they trained to notice those subtleties, to understand cultural differences? What are the techniques they use to ensure that the messages get across?
Well, the officers, they have to fill in, well, they have to listen in the first place, try to understand as much as they can, but in the end, they have to convert this complex personal narrative or personal experiences, complex events into a bureaucratic account. Do they really have strategies for that? Well, they have a fixed number of questions that they have to answer. But I think this is the most tricky thing about the whole procedure, is that you have this enormous gap between the story, which is an oral, spoken, conversational type of discourse that has to be translated in many cases in the first place. But on top of that, on top of this interlingual form of mediation, if you like, it has to be rephrased into a textual residue almost, which is there is so much filtering, there is so much noise on the communication. Translation is an important part of that. But on top of that, there is rephrasing. There is even further forms of translation, because sometimes interviews are conducted in English, but it's not a procedural language, so it has to be translated into Dutch. So it's very, very complex. And the problem is that all these levels of filtering tend to be underestimated by the institutions, and they're no longer visible in the end. So in the end, you have a textual residue, the word I've used, and this is still attributed to the applicants.
Although it has been recontextualized many, many times, really, you know.
Indeed.
Can you think of an example where something to do with interpreting or translation really had a huge impact, be that positive or negative?
Yeah, actually last week I received an email from an immigration lawyer. I think that would be a good example. It's a very recent one. It also demonstrates that even though we've been working on these problems for years now, it's still common practice even today. And she asked me for advice about a particular case of a woman from Sierra Leone, West African country. The woman spoke Temne. Temne is a local African language. But the interpreter they used was an interpreter of a Creole language, and the specific language they were using was Nigerian broken English. That's where it comes from. It sounds
so like Nigerian pidgin, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a pidgin English, but of course it's a fully fledged language. It's a language in its own right. But the problem was that, of course, in the first, well, actually there were two types of underestimation, let's say, of this linguistic variation. First of all, a woman from Sierra Leone cannot be presumed to be a speaker of that Creole language. Secondly, even if she were a speaker of that language, then the question is to what extent a speaker of a Creole language thousands of miles away from Sierra Leone would be able to interpret in a faithful way. And maybe this would suffice for everyday conversations. But the question is, because of the high stakes, because of the high level of detail, of consistency required, and the way it's linked to credibility issues, then such a language won't do. So this was, well, it had a serious impact on the eventual decision, and that's the reason why the immigration lawyer came to me and asked me for advice. So that's what I've done. I've tried to write down some of these issues that I just explained to you, and hopefully it will have an effect.
You've talked about credibility a lot already, and what I'm thinking of then, Katrijn, in these circumstances is the emotions that people have as well when they're telling their stories, and the extent to which these emotions may actually undermine credibility, or perhaps quite the opposite. If there are no emotions present, then people might not be credible at all. So I was just wondering, how do you go from stories that are very emotionally laden to the objective facts in the report, and what is the role of the interpreter in that? What do you teach students of interpreting what they have to do in those settings?
Well, in fact, interpreters have the role interpreters have to play in this is really limited. It's not their responsibility to turn emotional stories into bureaucratic records. This is the responsibility of asylum officers. The only thing that interpreters can do is, as faithfully as possible, get the message across. And if this is an emotional message, then they have to get it across as such. And if the asylum officer thinks this is not genuine, or this requires further details, further additional information, then it's up to the officer to ask the question. But an interpreter, strictly speaking, is not involved in this. Now, I'm saying strictly speaking because one of the main issues nowadays, well, it's always been a problem, is that it's very hard to find professional certified interpreters for particular languages. And then I'm talking about, for example, the languages spoken in Afghanistan, in Syria, Eritrea, Farsi, Pashto, Tigrinya. As a result, asylum agencies have to work with people who are bilingual, who speak one of these languages and a target language like English or French. But the problem is they have not been trained as interpreters. And then there might be interference. There might be interpreters who are no longer neutral, let's say, and who start kind of accommodating or helping the officer to do this very, very difficult work of reproducing something emotional, something experiential into something factual. And the way they do this, and I've observed this in my data, is that they rephrase certain expressions into something which is much more formal, less involved, just to make the job of the asylum officer easier. So the filtering is something they do on behalf of the asylum officer with the best intentions, just to make it easier. But then they're taking sides, they're no longer neutral. And this is something that we, of course, try to prepare our students for, that. Of course, they're not allowed, they're not supposed to do that.
Wow, that's an excellent example. We've been talking about how translators and interpreters are decision makers rather than just machines who translate something from the source language to target language. So, this is just goes to prove the point how important those decisions are in terms of not rephrasing, not summarizing, not toning down, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And something else that we definitely want to teach, and probably one of the most important ingredients of the interpreter's deontology, I believe, is transparency. So it can happen, and especially in settings of asylum and migration, that as an interpreter, you've been hired for a job, for instance, for English. But when you arrive there, you do realize that you cannot do the job properly because either you do not speak the variety or you feel too emotionally involved. Then transparency, you have to signal this. You have to not just continue and do the best you can, because sometimes the best you can is not good enough in such a situation that is so consequential for individuals.
Well, thank you, Katrin. That is certainly another example of very high stakes translating and interpreting, which we deal with in this episode. I'm glad we got your insights on that. It's a very important part of translating and interpreting. And I'm glad we got you on the podcast episode. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katrin. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Right, so this was another clear example of how complex and complicated translation and interpreting contexts can be. So again, the machine metaphor doesn't work at all, does it?
Not at all.
And I also noticed that there's a lot of intralingual translation going on during these asylum seeking procedures, which many people may not be aware of. So I find that very interesting.
Yeah, that you look at different varieties of English, for instance, and also you go from one modality to the other, that something spoken becomes something written. And of course, you have, a lot of sometimes very different cultural backgrounds where translation happens. And that's actually something that we may hear more about now in the analysis. I'm very happy to welcome Victoria Niederger-Schröder to our analysis part of this podcast. Victoria is a PhD researcher at the Department of Professional and Intercultural Communication at the Norwegian School of Economics. And she works on corporate communication, intercultural communication, language and translation. And she is actually also an accredited translator for French and Norwegian. So welcome, Victoria.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Victoria, you're going to talk about a company called Keolis. What do we know about this company?
Yeah, Keolis is interesting. It's a multinational transportation company operating public transport systems. It's based in France, but it manages buses and various transport systems in a range of cities from the US to Sweden, London, Manchester. It has about 70,000 employees.
Yes, and Victoria, it features in your PhD, right? So how would you introduce the company from your point of view?
Well, I was a former employee of the Norwegian subsidiary of Keolis, where I worked within communications. And it largely inspired my PhD project because it was so interesting to see how corporate communication was adapted in local subsidiaries. Because in fact, Keolis, they say that subsidiaries are free to adapt, not only translate, but adapt corporate communication locally.
Right. We're actually looking at some of these adaptations right now, and we have them in front of us. Could you please elaborate a bit there or point out the highlights that you want to share with us based on your findings so far?
Yes, because when you look at these texts, I've chosen 3 ones. So the English version from the headquarters, and then the Danish version that they use in Denmark, and the English language version that they use in India. And just by looking at them, you see straight away that they're really different. The website design, they're found on the websites of the subsidiaries and the headquarters, and they're really different. You see the colors are similar, but apart from that, they're really different. What you see in common is the structure of the corporate value statement. So you have the 3 value terms, and then...
So that's we imagine, we care, and we commit.
Exactly. And they are kept the same in English throughout. And then you have an explicitation or a paragraph describing each value.
So what we have is, first of all, we could point out really that the one in the headquarters, although the headquarters are in France, they're actually in English, the website. So we're looking at lingua franca here. And then we put it on the blog, but we have some color and design mix for these 3 values. We imagine, we care, we commit explanations. And we have the same design for the Danish website, although what you call the explicitation, Victoria, there is in Danish, right?
Yes, so I've provided a back translation into English so that everyone can follow.
And is that bug translation different from the English original?
Oh, yes, it's very different. Because what I found when looking at these texts, because what I wanted to do, I wanted to see what translation shifts we find when the subsidiaries are allowed to adapt such content. And then I was prepared to compare, sentence to sentence between the versions. But this turned out to be impossible because they were so radically rewritten, actually. And that meant that, for example, in the Danish one, if I look at the first sentence there of the explicitation of we imagine, it's simply not corresponding. You cannot say they're going to be corresponding to each other. So I had to analyze this. I had to find another way than to look at each sentence. And that's when I found that the framework of social actor analysis that you, Veronica, and Erica present in your textbook, Language and Business, Language at Work, and also in the article, Social Actors to Go. And this was really enabled me to shed light on the way the social actors are constructed in this text and the relationship between them and find differences, shifts in this way.
And how are they different? I'm really looking forward to an explanation about the specifics.
Yes. So first of all, I simply wanted to find out who are the social actors present in the different versions. And I specifically looked at Keolis because the sentence subject throughout is Keolis or we. And as you've talked about it before, we is very tricky, right? It can mean so many different things. And for example, if we start looking at the headquarter version under the value of we care, we see that the two first sentences seem to correspond to a social actor of Keolis Group as a whole. So we ensure millions of people are satisfied every day by placing the passenger at the heart of our network planning and operations. So here they're talking about Keolis, all-encompassing, everyone, and also in the second sentence. But then when we move on to the third sentence, also starting with we, they say we motivate our 68,500 employees. And suddenly there's a distinction here between we and our employees. So it's a different we here. It's not we Keolis as a group. It's we headquarter management probably, or the headquarter, and then the employees.
So typical of corporate communication. Yes, I found that in other similar texts as well. Yes.
So this is micro-level analysis, the linguistic features of these texts. My question then could be, we have been talking about high stakes. Why is this high stakes? Because some people might think, well, does it matter that much? And I would like to hear why this is high stakes, why these adaptations are there.
Well, why do companies at all implement corporate values? It's to use them as a managerial tool and a unifying force across a global organization. And then, so of course, the linguistic material that form the basis of these values will have an impact on how they succeed internationally. And that's why it's important to look at how are they actually disseminated linguistically into local subsidiaries. And you say, yes, this is micro level, but what is really interesting is that you can pull it up to a more macro level. Because I looked at the Globe cultural framework of cultural differences, and I was able then to connect these things. Because then when we look at the Indian version, the we care of the Indian version, we see here that the first mentions of Keolis seem to be that of a group, the group. Actually, the first sentence is a group, all-encompassing group. But then in the second sentence, Keolis is a respectful group committed to integrating and encouraging its employees.
So it's not our employees, it's its employees now. So that's more distant.
Exactly. So here, Keolis and we is not the same in this corporate value statement. And then you have this final sentence, which is also different from the
original?
Yes. It starts with we. We care for our employees, our customers, our city, singular. And suddenly we see that now we are local in the subsidiary. And now this is actually almost like a pledge from the subsidiary saying that we commit to the values of Keolis Group.
Right. So basically avoiding alienation and increasing alignment. That's what they're doing, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And then in the Danish version, you actually don't find any mention of the group at all. Everything is just we, apart from one sentence. So it's really subsidiary focused. And then if you look at the cultural dimensions here, if you look at the cultural dimension of in-group collectivism, so the degree to which individuals express pride, loyalty, and cohesiveness in their organizations, then we see that the Indian one is very high on this, while the Danish one, they don't mention their group belonging at all. So this could actually signal these cultural differences. And of course, we don't know if they did it on purpose or not. But in any way, it's likely to appeal more to the Danish audience.
That's interesting. Was such a fascinating insight about how even details that could easily be overlooked can make a difference in corporate communication. So across different subsidiaries. Thank you very much, Victoria, for this insight. We've come to the end of our episode, I'm afraid. And so we've talked a lot about translation, interpreting, the issues about it, what decisions translators and interpreters make, etc. You may wonder why we didn't talk too much about automatic translation, but if you stay tuned, our next episode will actually be on language and technology, and we're going to come back to that. But for now, it's goodbye from us.
Bye.
Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the podcast, which was brought to you with the support of the Centre of Critical Inquiries into Society and Culture at Aston University in the UK and the Department of Translation, Interpreting and Communication at the University of Ghent, Belgium.